Hello audience, my name is Dalton Mortimer, I am the Authenticator, and welcome to A Mystic's Vlogs. Long story short, the Salmon Overture review is taking rather longer than I had hoped, and I will be damned, possibly literally, to whatever hell awaits lazy artists, if I let all of October pass without me at least putting out some content. So, given there is a large preponderance of fantasy shows, movies, etc. out there, and very little of it ever takes an occultist view into account, I thought that might be an interesting role for me to occupy. And as such, I figured we would start with Legends of Tomorrow, Season 4, Episode 1, The Virgin Gary. Terrible title, by the way. I would have gone with Unicorns at Woodstock, or possibly The Virgin and the Unicorn. Far better titles, but I digress. A few ground rules, though, before we begin this new project. No, I'm not going to cover every fantasy show or fantasy movie out there, and I'm not going to cover things post hoc for the most part. I might get around to them at some point, but for the most part, I'm going to consider myself with what is current and what has an explicit magical, mystical, mythological, or folkloric focus. And yes, it is going to be focused predominantly on how these things relate to the depictions of such. Because I firmly believe that good fantasy content should do for magic, mysticism, mythology, and folklore what good science fiction does for science, i.e., take an abstract, hard to grasp, or difficult to deal with concept and either make it easier or scale it up in some significant way to advance the plot. So don't be expecting me to cover Charmed, either the old one or the reboot, because old Charmed was the worst kind of new agey schlock even at its best moments, and new Charmed is insufferable twaddle, preaching a social justice lens, and no thank you. Certainly not every week. Moving on, though. Because I am a massive nerd, but I am also a student of the occult and have been such for more than a decade, and it is high time that magic stop being used as a synonym for Deus Ex Machina, and it is also high time that the false expertise given to people like Arthur C. Clarke be thrown out on its ear. And to that end, let's begin with Legends of Tomorrow, Season 4, Episode 1, terribly titled The Virgin Gary. So our episode begins with our heroes, the ostensible legends of tomorrow, coming back and lampshading what appears to be the final anachronism. After some interpersonal bollocks, which I will skip over because I don't particularly care for the CW interpersonal drama, we get a scene with our ostensible intern legend for this season, Gary, the bumbling time agent, who I mention because he is important to the plot, and our team apparently quite verklempt by the lack of action, all except, of course, for Sarah, who would very much like to get back to her twin flame, Agent Sharp. A romantic scene which is quite ruined by the arrival of a certain exorcist, demonologist, and master of the dark arts, who I was pleased to see that Sarah was able to recognize by the simple click of his Zippo. Well done, dear. Because apparently, after a slight throw of the bone to those of us that were Constantine NBC fans, the darkness was rising, which of course relates back to how the last season ended, with Constantine apparently off-screen slaying a dragon with said bubbling intern Gary. and he brings out the bones of a minor saint, which I can only imagine he must have bought in bulk because he uses those types of relics all the time, and those types of things are not typically particularly easy to come by, even for someone who is well versed in this shit. Anyway, after Constantine's bone freaks everyone out by going stiff, giggity, despite the apparent lack of anachronisms detected by the Time Bureau, Sarah tries desperately to ignore it for about 2 scenes and then goes to investigate. It turns out that our monster of the week, which, if you haven't caught on yet, is a unicorn, is currently harassing and haranguing the denizens of Woodstock in the 1960s. Which, how the hell did Constantine's spell detect that if it had already happened? I suppose he could have put a spell on it to filter out temporal anomalies. But if he knew or was willing to amend them like that in the first place, why would he bother with something that had such a unique and apparently single-use magical energy resonance to it? Anyway, if we get hung up too much on Constantine's lazy ass attitude when it comes to spell work, we'll be here all day. So let's move on to the inevitable everyone finds out about the unicorn and shows up at Woodstock portion of the program. It was an interesting take on a unicorn, I'll say that. Well, unicorns are drawn to the things in the world that are good and pure of heart. In this case, only the heart, in the sense that it harpoons things with its horn and then pigs out upon the heart. And if said thing puts up any kind of struggle, it releases some kind of magic that causes severe psychotropic hallucinations. I did enjoy the lampshading of why no one fucking noticed a unicorn at Woodstock by simply pointing out that everyone there was probably about as high as any given Wicker Man celebration. So, yeah, I wouldn't notice either. And though they did miss a massive thing they could have done with the 60s, given the 60s and Woodstock was also one of the major locusts of the New Age revival. Basically the epicenter of all the New Age self-help woo. So, if you wanted to make a specifically magic-oriented season, why not focus on the fact that the time period you're traveling to has some specific magical orientation to it? But wasted potential and all that, so I guess moving on. I just thought it was important to mention because it would have been nice had they at least referenced it. Anyway, interesting unused side note is still a side note, so back to our main attraction for a while because it'll come up and be important later. The unicorn is traditionally associated with the Greco-Roman orthodoxy, although there are also Celtic variations which suggest it might actually be some type of fae, which fits quite well given this version of a unicorn is quite, shall we say, ravenous, and that falls in line with a good number of fairy lores that aren't just specific to a unicorn. Kelpies, for example, are a type of water spirit that will take the form of a very beautiful horse, offer people rides, and then drown them in whatever water they are linked inextricably to. So, yes, it does fit to have a unicorn be a little bit psychotic, given that it is either a creature from Greco-Roman mythology or a fae. As such, though, I was left scratching my head something fierce when, in order to battle said unicorn, Johnny's first impulse was to pull out the Grimoire of Solomon, which was probably a slight rebranding of one of the keys of Solomon, to which my response was, why in all of the hell dimensions would Johnny even think to reach for a Solomonic text to deal with a fucking unicorn? Because as we just established, they're either Greco-Roman or Celtic, or both. In which case, it probably would have done better to reach for a grimoire that had some Ogham in it, or possibly some ancient Greek. But no, not our Johnny boy. He apparently sees a unicorn and thinks, gee, let me grab that explicitly Abrahamic text that deals mostly with jinn and lesser unclean spirits. Derp. And more importantly, why is he successful? Why the fuck is there a unicorn-related spell in what appears to be the Key of Solomon? Granted, they did give themselves something of an out when he said that it was Solomon's original grimoire, implying that the keys were derivative of it in some way. So, I suppose, in the original unedited text of Solomon's grimoire, it is possible that he had a unicorn spell. But, somehow, it still makes me want to slap my head in perpetuity for the rest of time. Now, if they were dealing with a jinn, genie, or demon, I would probably not bat an eye. In fact, I would have thought that it's probably the best and possibly only text worthwhile when dealing with such entities. Unfortunately, they decided to pull this out on a unicorn, so it makes no fucking sense. But they at least get the lore regarding unicorns right again, albeit in a slightly confusing and adjusted for the plot way, in the same way that your average Supernatural episode is. Namely, that unicorns are drawn to things that are virginal and pure. And being as it's Woodstock and everyone is fucking because sexual revolution, the only virgin that is applicable is our buddy Gary. See, I told you it would be important later. No wonder the episode is named after him, albeit quite horribly. Anyway, so they give Gary a pomegranate and attempt to use him as unicorn bait. Side note regarding the pomegranate, maybe this was a reference to the fact that unicorns are actually traditionally associated with ancient Greco-Roman, or at the very least European, mythos. Because, of course, pomegranates are traditionally associated with Greek underworld in the sense that they were the food given to Persephone by Hades in order to bind her to the underworld. Moving right along, though, as the unicorn both figuratively and literally bites, and Constantine starts his conjuration to apparently send the thing to hell. And once again, I must point out, that's remarkably stupid, given that, by all rights, he should be sending it either to one of the Greek underworlds, or perhaps the Celtic otherworld. And more importantly, I think it would have been much more interesting for Johnny, given that send it to hell is basically his solution to everything. And it would have been nice to see him have to think more laterally or horizontally, as opposed to his direct vertical orientation of the metaphysical planes that he always falls back to. But, I can't expect Constantine to act like a more well-versed mystic, and I think they just did all of this quasi-Solomonic bullshit so that his symbol that he conjures would bear some resemblance to the symbol that is now almost always associated with him, namely his Triangle of Solomon, elevated with Enochian scripts and some Elder runes that he always uses as a ward against spirits violating a particular space. Anyway, it works, and the unicorn gets quite a demonic facelift, which I can't tell is supposed to be the result of Johnny's spell, or is supposed to be something akin to revealing its true face underneath a glamour. If it is the true face thing, they're once again borrowing a little bit more heavily from Kelpie lore, because that is something that traditionally happens with a Kelpie once its horse form, or other form that it sometimes takes to lure people into the water, is dilapidated away, it usually forms something of a demonic trickster guise to it. Anyway, the thing is sent to hell, and all is well again for the legends. Sarah comes clean to her girlfriend, who she's been lying to this entire episode to avoid telling her about the new anachronisms. She says she knew already, and I don't feel bad for having skipped over most of the interpersonal bullshit for this episode. Johnny behaves like his usual antisocial self when asked to be a legend, because apparently in between the interim of the last time he was on the show and now he's fucked something up again. Good on you, Johnny. See, nothing changes. And I begin to slowly wrap things up. Although I should mention before we move on from this scene that Johnny does display slightly more power than I thought he possessed, because usually he doesn't directly manifest telekinetic things, but he appears to be able to open his front door with little more than a single incantation of little more than a couple words of Latin. Which, granted, that might be explained by him having done something to the door to make it easier via prep work, but who knows. They might just be playing fast and loose with Johnny's powers and forgetting that he's a street mage whenever it's convenient. So, all in all. So to wrap things up, let me give my general overview of what I thought of the episode, tie in some loose ends from things that I talked about previously but never really concluded, and give some speculation for the cliffhanger at the end of the episode and what I think will happen next time. Mostly I found the majority of the soap opera-esque who's dating whom, who's in a relationship with whom, who's dealing with whose daddy issues stuff to be annoying. Sarah and Ava are fine. They're genuinely shippable, and I want to see them work things out, mostly because I actually care what happens to them by virtue of some pretty good acting and some pretty decent chemistry between Sarah and Ava for the most part. Johnny, as played as always at this point by Matt Ryan, who is forever the definitive Constantine until somebody does better, which I highly doubt. He has elapsed into the point of being the one I hear when I read Constantine's dialogue whenever I read a Constantine or Hellblazer comic, so good on you, Matt Ryan. Always compelling, even when Johnny is being slightly more an asshole than usual as per the plot. I did dislike, though, that his spells were more visual this time, because as lame as the Latin chanting is, it is slightly more accurate to how magic is actually depicted, usually. Not to mention more reliant on Matt Ryan's skills as an actor, which, as I just confirmed, are superb in the sense that he has done for Constantine what Robert Downey Jr. did for Tony Stark, and what I desperately hope and wish Benedict Cumberbatch eventually does for Doctor Strange. As to the next episode, I'm slightly worried that the get-up they're sporting is puritanical in nature, because I'm worried they'll squelch their opportunity for the witch trials. Seriously, you have a magical-oriented season. You have John Constantine, as played by Matt Ryan, as one of the main members of your cast. You have the ability to travel in time, and apparently the budget for pretty decent Puritan costumes, and you're going to waste what appears to be the Salem witch trials on a skirmish with a fairy godmother instead of tying it to anything to do with witchcraft. Okay. As to the cliffhanger, I don't have any ideas really of what they're going to do, but I know what I would like to see them try to do. And that is tied together this and Constantine City of Demons, the miniseries turned movie that just came out recently, where he banished Nergal, his big bad demon, from the physical plane, and left him disembodied. Hopefully, what we saw at the end was him getting harassed by a very angry Nurgle who, having recovered from the Cadaver curse, is now coming for Johnny even more, and the reason why Johnny is being such a bitch recently is because he had to wipe the memory of his friend and his friend's closest family. But a guy can dream. Until then, though, I will see you all when the next mystical juncture happens, and we do another Mystics vlog. Cheers all. Cheers everyone. I'll see you next time.